Class. Today's video is going to be on section 9.2, measuring area and volume. We're doing area and volume conversions. The measuring area and volume, that's more chapter 10 when we get into geometry stuff. But all right, if you watch the 9.1 video on the dimensional analysis for length, the process is exactly the same when we're talking about area and volume conversions. There are, dealing with area and volume being 2 and 3 dimensions, there's a little bit more involved with that, like where the units come from. So I want to probably spend like more time talking about that than the conversions, because the conversions are straightforward, like I said, just like we did in 9.1. So if you're following along with the lecture note outlines, this is the continuation of the chapter 9 notes on page 2, looks like. Yeah. So let's just jump into it and get going. For 9.2, this is going to be a relatively short video. Let's look at some units that we're going to be dealing with. And so before we get into like the given ones, let's explore where these numbers are coming from. So a square foot is how many square inches? Now notice that sometimes we're going to say square feet with SQ, or we can use the exponent of 2. The reason we call that yards squared or feet squared is because it gets its name from actual square. So before they had exponents with the scientific notation several thousand years ago, they were dealing with geometry and squares and cubes and stuff. So that's where the language is coming from. A little historical note. So 1 square foot is how many square inches? Often the first response I get on that is that it's 12. Right? And so let's explore where that's coming from and how that's different now that we're dealing with squares. So we know that we know 1 foot is equal to 12 inches. Right, so that's a given. But now if we're dealing with a square foot, that means we're dealing with a square that is actually 1 foot on each side. Now, this is a little bit of a preview for chapter geometry. How do we find the area of a square or a rectangle? It's length times width, base times height, whichever you prefer. It's 1 foot times 1 foot. What is 1 foot times 1 foot? Well, 1 times 1 is 1. But now what is feet times feet? Often the answer I get there is it's just a foot. But what is x times x? Well, that's x that, we talked about this a little bit. You add the exponents, and we use exponents for repeated multiplication. So if x times x is x squared, that means feet times feet is feet squared. Or 1 square foot, if you prefer to write it that way. All right, so how does that help us with the inches conversion? Well, now, since we're dealing square inches, now we have a square that is 12 inches by 12 inches. The area for this is 12 inches times 12 inches. And so if you do get a calculator, 12 times 12, that's 144. Now inches times inches is inches squared. Or you could say 144 SQ inches. Sorry, I'm trying not to sneeze. So what we have is 1 square foot is equal to 144 square inches. So the common mistake that students make on dealing with area and volume is not squaring it or not cubing it. So this is, sorry, I wrote it wrong. So 144, sorry. Did all that math and then wrote down the wrong answer. So 1 square foot is 144 square inches because we have to do 12 times 12 since we're dealing with a square. Now, if you look on the next page, we have this with cubic for volume as well. So 1 cubic foot is how many cubic inches? Well, let's go back to the drawing. So now we're dealing with a cube. I didn't leave myself enough room up here, so I'm going to have to kind of cut it short. But now, if you're dealing with a box, we're dealing with the volume. Well, volume is length times width times height for a box. So that's 1 foot times 1 foot times 1 foot. So foot times foot times foot is just like x times x times x, which would be x cubed. So that would be 1 cubic foot. All right, so that's what we mean by a cubic foot or foot to the third power. As we're dealing with a box, that's 1 foot on each side. Now, if we want this in inches, again, do your box, but now instead of having each side be a foot, we're going to say each side is 12 inches. So how do you get the volume? Well, length times width times height. So 12 inches times 12 inches times 12 inches. And what is 12 times 12 times 12? Whatever 144 times 12 is. So 1728. The 1 cubic foot is equal to 1,728 cubic inches. So it's and another way to do this in terms of, so this is like the geometry explanation. If you want to do a conversion explanation, so if I want 1 square foot to how many square inches, so we can do the conversion. So I'm starting with 1 square foot. Now I want to convert it to inches. Well, assume we didn't do the geometry and get that it's 144 square inches. How do we convert feet to inches? Well, I know 1 foot is 12 inches. But here, does that foot cancel out foot squared? No, it only cancels out 1. So we actually have to do this twice. So now feet times feet is feet squared. And so then you get 12 times 12. That is our 144 square inches. If you wanted to do this for volume, so this would be cubed. And so then we'd have to have a third fraction with 12 inches over 1. And that's where we would get the 1728. Okay. All right, so that's, if you were making these conversions from scratch, this is sort of what you have to do. So let's go back to, okay, so we now know that 1 square foot is 144 square inches. So what would you say about how many square feet is a square yard? Well, we know 1 yard is 3 feet, but now we need to make it a square. So we're going to do 3 feet times 3 feet. So 1 square yard is 9 square feet. And we're doing it in cubic on the next page. So 1 cubic yard, well, now we have a box that's 3 times 3 times 3. So 27 cubic feet. All right. So you're going to be given these area and volume conversions, but I thought it would be helpful to kind of talk about this. Like, for example, if you're going to buy carpet for a room, you're going to be dealing in, you need to figure out like the square footage. And then at some point, you're probably going to convert that to square yardage because, you might get sold your carpet square yardage. So, these are like knowing where these come from is helpful. I do want to point out something else, like here, that 1 acre is 43,560 feet. One of the mistakes that students make sometimes with the area and the volume is they want to square the number as well. But here's where you have to be careful, because this is not 43,560 feet in parentheses squared. There is no parentheses. So if it was inside the parentheses, then we would square both. Since there is no parentheses, the only thing getting squared is the feet. So, but basically they've already done the arithmetic to figure out what the number is, so don't square it again, don't cube it again. If they give you that conversion factor, that is the number that you use. Now, just a completely side note, sort of random. as I was looking at my notes, I was like, well, what is an acre? Where did it come from? And so it turns out that apparently an acre is, if I remember correctly, it's 660 feet long by 60 feet wide. Where this came from was somehow it was decided that's how much land a farmer could plow in a day with a pair of oxen without turning around or something like that. It's um, yeah, the English system, yeah, it is a bit weird. So, um, but but you're given most of these units. So there's 640 acres in a square mile. 1 square centimeter is 100 square millimeters. Yeah, so you got some of the metric. And where this is coming from is, like 1 meter is 100 centimeters, while 100 times 100 is where the 10,000 is coming from. So we're squaring the 100 just like we squared the 3 to get the 9. Yeah. So that's length sort of area. For volume, for the English to English, we have 16 fluid ounces is 1 pint. 1 quart is 2 pints. When I ask this in class, very few people know that. I don't always remember it, like how many cups are in a pint and all that sort of stuff. 4 quarts are a gallon. That's pretty straightforward because a quart means a quarter. And there might be others, but definitely in this unit, most of those conversions, if you don't have them, will either be on your formula sheet or MyMathLab often puts those on the page. There's also other ways to do it, and I'll bring up MyMathLab and show you. But it's not like we don't use these near as much as we do the weight and the length, so we tend to give you more of those. All right, so let's see how that's the kind of the background on this. Let's see how the conversions work. So 22.4 miles squared to acres. So if you've watched the 4.1 or sorry 9.1 video, then we're following the same exact setup. So whatever you're starting with, put that as a fraction over 1. 22.4 miles squared. Yeah. And now we need a conversion fraction, or maybe more than one. So do we know a direct conversion from miles squared to acres? Look back on the previous page, 1 square mile is 640 acres. So how do we set that up? Well, we're trying to get rid of miles squared. Miles squared is on top, so on the next fraction, it needs to be in the bottom. So now what are our numbers? 1 mile squared is 640 acres. Now the miles squared cancel out. And now we're just doing 22.4 times 640. That is 14,336 acres. That's a lot of oxen pairs, a lot of farmers plowing the fields. That would probably take that would take, if they could do that in a day, that would be like 360 instead of 14,000. That was one farmer plowing a field that big. It would take them 39 years to do that. Yeah, where that came from. Okay, so the conversions work the same. Doesn't matter if we're talking length, if we're talking area, talking volume. If you're using the conversion process that we've talked about, that makes it all pretty much a straightforward problem. Okay, how about 400 square inches to square feet? So 400 inches squared over 1. Now we talked about this, 144 square inches in a square foot. So we want the square inches on bottom. There's 144 of those in 1 square foot. And I'm interchangeably, I tend to use exponents of saying SQ for squared. And it doesn't really matter which one you use as long as you know they mean the same thing. So now we're just doing 400 divided by 144. Okay, so here is the answer I'm getting on the calculator. So remember, for unit conversions, unless MyMathLab specifically says, we're getting decimal answers, not fraction answers. And so what do we do with this? Well, if you have an answer that's a fraction that or a decimal that goes on forever, MyMathLab is going to tell you where to round. Even if it doesn't go on forever, I think they usually only like one or two decimal places. Let's say we round this to the nearest hundredth. So the hundredth is the second decimal place. So we're looking there, that's 5 or higher, so it tells us to add 1 to that 7. So that would be 2.78 square feet. So we will occasionally have to round on these problems because we might get some long decimal numbers. Okay. And a lot of these area and volume problems are one-step conversions. You don't even need 2 steps. So that makes them quicker. Just sort of depends on the problem. Let's do one more here, and then we'll go to the book, or sorry, to MyMathLab. 0.024 meters squared to millimeters squared. What do we know about meters squared and millimeters squared? We go to your conversions. 1 meter square is 1,000 millimeters squared. And that 1,000 is because 1 meter is 1,000 millimeters, and 1,000 times 1,000 is the million. How do we set this up? Well, we need meters squared on bottom to cancel out. So 1 meter squared is a million millimeters squared. I'd hate to have to count those by hand. Meters squared cancel. The 0.024 times a million is 24,000 millimeters squared. Yeah, and just think about this. If we were going the other way, if we were starting with millimeters squared, and going to meters squared, it would expect really small decimal numbers, because a millimeter is, it's, I don't know, about the thickness of the ballpoint, the part of the pen, and a meter is a little over a yardstick. So once you start squaring it, it gets a small percentage per liquid. All right, so that's mathematical conversions. We also have like English to English. When you're doing quarts to gallons, there's 4 quarts in a gallon. For fluid ounces to pints, 16 fluid ounces is a pint. So that's let's do 32. I think it's the only one on this page. It's not one step. The 34 pints. No, I was thinking something else. Do we know pints to gallons? No, yeah, we don't know pint. We don't have pints to gallons, so yeah, that was it. All right. So what do we know about pints? Well, we know that 1 pint is 16 fluid ounces. I don't want to go there because fluid ounces is really small, gallons is big. But I also know that 2 pints is a quart. How does that help us? Is that we know that 4 quarts is 1 gallon. So this is going to be a 2-step conversion. So we want pints to quarts. So we need pints on bottom. So 2 pints is 1 quart. Now we need to convert quarts to gallons. So quarts needs to go on bottom on the next fraction. So 4 quarts is 1 gallon. Okay, now this is where, since you have 2 numbers on the bottom, definitely do your multiply first. On the top, we have 34. On the bottom, 2 times 4 is 8. And then do your division last. So 34 divided by 8 is 4.25. All right, so 34 pints is 4.25 gallons. So again, as an instructor, I feel like other than kind of talking about like how yards and cubic feet or inches um, relate, I don't feel like I've done anything new here because the conversion process works exactly like 4.1, sorry, 9.1. Let's get into MyMathLab and see if there's any type of problems I haven't discussed. Okay, here's the first question. Again, I always like to start off with sort of definition type stuff. Area is measured in blank units, square, linear, or cubic. This is something I'll definitely hit harder in the geometry section, but area is always two-dimensional. So area is always squared. Volume is always three-dimension. So its volume is always cubic. Square is like square inches, square centimeters, square miles. Volume is cubic, so cubic inches, cubic centimeters, and so on. So 1 cubic centimeter or 1 cc. This is actually just one of the, if you looked at if you watched the metric system video I did, this is just a basic definition of the metric system. 1 cubic centimeter is 1 milliliter. That's just a basic definition. That's one of the nice things about the metric system is that length you can connect it to volume, which we can't do that in the English system, but that's the connection there. All right, so how about this problem? So convert 36.1 HA to acres. Well, what is HA? Well, if you come over here on the chart, HA is a hectare, which a hectare is the metric version of an acre. Okay. So let's do this problem. We're converting 36.1 hectares to English acres. All right, and we know that 1 acre is 0.4 hectares. So we're starting with 36.1 hectares over 1. So how do we convert that to acres? Well, we need hectares on bottom, so 0.4 hectares on bottom, 1 acre. So again, this is just a very basic dimensional analysis problem. So now we're dividing 36.1 by 0.4. That gives us 90.25 acres. And we're getting it, even though we're dividing, we're getting a bigger number because we're dividing by a decimal less than 1. So that's there's nothing wrong with that, but we'd only get a smaller number if we're dividing by a number bigger than 1. All right. So even though there's a good chance that you have no idea what a hectare is because we never use it in this country. You don't need to know what it is if you have the conversion factor. That's one of the powers of dimensional analysis is if you're paying attention to the units, you can do the math without fully understanding like where it's all coming from. Like being able to do dimensional analysis allows me to occasionally help physics students do problems when I don't remember like what they're actually doing big picture wise. By looking at their units, I can often help them answer the questions. It's a very powerful tool. Okay, so like here, 4 liters to cubic centimeters. Well, we know we're given that 1 liter is 1,000 cubic centimeters. And so you have a straight conversion, that's a one-step problem. I do want to point out here, we talked about it, mentioned this already, but if you're converting cubic centimeters or cc's to milliliters, it's a 1-to-1 conversion. So if you started with 4 cubic centimeters, you would have 4 milliliters. That's not a trick question. That's just that's like a very basic conversion. You don't have any fancy numbers to deal with. Is there anything different here? Oh, this is the sort of problem I was looking for. So in here, we are converting, anytime we're doing English to metric, right, like I said, these are typically weird numbers. You don't expect you to know them. You're going to be giving them one way or the other. Notice there is no chart on here, but just click on the table. So on some of these MyMathLab problems, you do have to, and this is why you need like pop-up blockers allowed, so that because if you have pop-up blockers on, and you couldn't bring up the table. But what are we doing? We're converting tablespoons to milliliters. So that's the conversion that you need, is that 1 tablespoon is 15 milliliters, and you just set it up just like we've been doing. So if you're needing conversions, look for that. Sometimes if you're on your phone, like typically, phones typically often use Safari, which has problems like that. That's why you typically need a laptop and why you need Chrome when you're doing these problems. All right. So converting acres to square miles. Well, there's your conversion right there. 1 square mile, 640 acres. So these are pretty basic problems in terms of what we've been doing. This last one, here are 2 island countries. We're given the area, determine which country has the bigger area and by how many square kilometers. So notice here, this one is in square kilometers for country A. This one is in square miles for country B. So to be able to compare them, they both need to be either both kilometers squared or both miles squared. Well, which one do you go to? Well, the problem is asking in terms of square kilometers. So what you need to do is convert country B to square kilometers. How do you do that? Well, if you go here to the side, we're given that 1 square mile is 2.6 square kilometers. So that's just, you do 159,900 miles squared over 1. Your next fraction is going to be 2.6 kilometers squared over 1 mile squared. Mile squared cancel, and then you get your area in square kilometers. And then what else? And then they're say by how, determine which one is the greater area. So once you get this one in square kilometers, then you'll just be able to look at them and see which one's bigger. And they say by how many. Well, by how many is you'll just subtract the 2 values and you know how much bigger it is. All right, so that is 9.2. So other than just kind of knowing how the square area or the cubic volumes work of units, it's straightforward mini conversions. All right, that's all I have for this video. Have a good day.